Yes.
Dr. Thomas, I'm going to ask you some questions about your practice when recording transfusions in patients' medical records. Is it right to understand that as the anaesthetist, you recorded during at the point that the transfusion was being carried out, you recorded it in the anaesthetic record?
That's correct, yes.
And then if blood was given on the ward or on ICU outside surgery, then that would be recorded in the fluid balance chart.
That's right.
And that was your practice, and was it also the practice of your other clinical colleagues throughout the Morrison and
we all did the same. We document all fluids, intravenous fluids and blood given during theatre would be on the anaesthetic sheet, and subsequent transfusions would be on the fluid balance.
What was recorded on the anaesthetic record?
Usually the hospital number of the patient would be on the record, and the recording of the number attached to the blood would be put into the anaesthetic record. The volume transfused, the type of blood component being transfused, and any identifying number on that. Usually there was a peel-off strip from the blood bag that was put into the anaesthetic sheet.
So we've heard from other witnesses being able to stick those into the records.
That's right. That was a later development. Initially it would be transcribed, but then it became obvious that much easier for everybody concerned and more accurate as well because of illegible handwriting, particularly of doctors, to record that correctly.
And we've heard from other witnesses that they noted that after a few years the sticky label could come loose. Is that an experience that you had?
Yes, it could come loose. I mean, one of the problems with that system was just the loss of fluid balance sheets. Clinical notes remain to this day, if in paper form, very, very disorganized, particularly when they're big volumes or on your second or third volume. So look-back exercises about seeing who had what blood is difficult to achieve from the clinical notes alone. Usually the computer system issuing the blood had that identifier on it, the person receiving the blood and which blood was issued to that individual. Doesn't necessarily mean it was given, and that's where you would rely on the anaesthetic sheet to show whether that was actually transfused or not.
And that computer record would have been generated at the blood bank, would it?
At the blood bank end, yes.
Was there any way in which the information was fed back from surgery or from the ward to the blood bank to tell the blood bank whether or not a particular component or unit had actually been transfused into the patient that it had been released for?
Usual practice at my institution was that any unused product was sent back to the blood bank. The difficulty with that is that it couldn't be reissued to somebody else because it had been out of what's called the cold chain of the blood product. So if it had been out of the temperature store for longer than 30 minutes, it was unusable by anybody else.
So does it follow from that if the blood bank did not get a unit back, they would assume that it had been transfused into the patient for whom it had been released? But
it may have been discarded. You're quite right. It's not absolutely fail-safe.
And do you know whether the blood bank then, on their records, on their computer records, then noted transfused or something on that computer system that allowed somebody at a glance to know what had happened to that unit?
The systems were fairly antiquated in the early 90s, even at that stage, to be able to identify that. And I found it extremely difficult getting data from the computer to give accurate data of that nature.
So you say in your statement that you had experience of audit and look back and so on, and that it was a painstaking process, as you've just said now. What did that tell you then about the system for recording whether or not components had been transfused to patients?
It was unreliable in the main. Subsequent systems improved that, but at the time of my appointment, it was very unreliable.
And when, can you recall when subsequent systems came in and became more reliable?
Became apparent that something needed to be done with the instigation of the SHOT initiative, where wrong component transfused to the wrong individual became a big issue. Incompatible blood component transfused. And it became obvious that we had to up the game in terms of that ID of both the individual blood component and the patient who was receiving it. But I suppose it didn't really hit home until the European Blood Directive, which is in the early 2000s, when it became law, European law, that we had complete traceability. And that fell at the time to the HTC and their representatives, which eventually became the Transfusion Practitioner, to chase up all those missing bits of detail about who had received what and wasted blood usage.
And so by the time you retired in March 2020, was there a reliable system at Morriston and Singleton hospitals for vein to vein, being able to trace vein to vein transfusion?
Well, again, it was there was a fail-safe system in that every unit issued by the blood bank had to be traceable, whether that had been returned, discarded, or given to a patient. So that was a fairly rigorous audit undertaken by the transfusion practitioners, aided by the development of a transfusion chart, which our own transfusion practitioner developed at a Morriston level, then at an all Wales level, and I think has been adopted in the UK. A little bit like a prescription chart, where everything is logged on that one chart.
And is there one transfusion chart per patient?
Per patient.
So that's another layer of information within the clinical notes.
Yes, and the first page of that document reminded the person transfusing the blood and prescribing the blood or blood component, had there been a recent hemoglobin taken, what were the reasons, was there a necessity for specific blood components like irradiated products. So there was a aid memoir on the front page which hopefully improved clinical practice.
And the benefit of that was that whereas previously you'd had to slot in the blood transfusion records into the anaesthetist records or into the fluid balance chart, this was a bespoke chart that, as you say, jogged memory and reminded people of clinicians of what they should be checking for and what they should be putting in. Yes,
and it had a specific colour on the corner of the page, which meant it was identifiable on searching through paper notes.
Now, you've said in your witness statement that documentation improved tremendously, and you've given us some how the system changed in terms of what was actually the information that was actually recorded. Did that improve as well? Was more information recorded than initially you told us that was put into the anaesthetic record?
Well, the recording of the identity of the blood component improved. Again, it may or may not have been a sticky label system that was used. It may have been a hybrid system on occasions. But I think generally people complied with that recording much better than they had previously.
And that was as a result of education, was it? And the Hospital Transfusion Committee, along with the Hospital Transfusion Practitioner?
Persuasion by the transfusion practitioner.
Did you, were you ever involved in writing discharge summaries or providing information to GPs when patients were discharged from hospital?
In my initial period on the ITU, discharge letters weren't issued from the ITU to the GP, but after my appointment, it was a system I'd seen in Adelaide at the time, where as soon as the patient was discharged from the ITU, a letter was sent to the GP informing them of the treatment that they had. And very often that was detail overload, I'm sure, for the GP, but it made sure that they understood how seriously unwell the patient had been. Because some of them would spend another several weeks in hospital before actual discharge from hospital. So it was a good update document to send to the GP at the time to keep him informed.
And would you have provided information in that discharge letter about whether or not your patient had been administered blood or blood components or blood products?
We would have mentioned that he required blood transfusion, particularly if it was an excessive transfusion, particularly. But that would have alerted the GP to the fact that he could have traced blood and blood components that patient had received from the hospital blood bank, if necessary.
Now, we've touched on your role both in the anaesthetic department and hospital-wide, and indeed Wales-wide in terms of blood transfusion practice. But I just want to ask you some further questions in relation to that. So is it right to understand that the role that you took on in advising, first of all, the anaesthetic department and then more widely on transfusion practice was initially, in any event, a self-appointed role?
It was initially, yes. And they could see that I was enthusiastic. I was never officially appointed as their spokesperson, but was often the person that was sought down for advice on transfusion issues.
And so is it right to understand that before that there wasn't a single point of contact or a person that was performing that role for either the anaesthetic department?
Not for the anaesthetic department, no.
In 1993, you've told us that you became instrumental in the development of the Hospital Transfusion Committee. What was it that prompted you to set it up at that time?
A combination of the other guidelines coming out, particularly from the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service. As we saw earlier, the handbook of transfusion was from Brian McClelland. He was quite influential. And when you get involved in a number of these issues, you tend to go to meetings where you meet the same people, like-minded people, and you try and adopt best practice. So that was one of the instigators of implementing a HTC. The blood bank chief was also keen, as was the haematologist in the department. In fact, I think the reason I ended up being the chair was to take the bullets for the haematologist. I mean, he found that clinical interface very difficult. So to have an intensivist that interacted on a day-to-day basis with transfusion issues was easier for him, and he would be backup to that when we wanted specific information. That worked well.
And at the time that you set up the HTC, were there any other HTCs in Wales that you knew about?
Not at the time, no.
And were they still quite unusual in the rest of the UK?
Yes, sporadic in the rest of the UK. There were pockets of enthusiasm, but not widespread. And
how was presumably you had the support of management, or you couldn't have got the HTC off the ground, is that right?
That's right. It didn't actually cost them anything, other than giving us a room once every 4 months. The biggest challenge was getting clinicians to come and attend. And we had great success because we had it at the end of a working day, 6 o'clock. We had a guillotine of 1 hour. We'd circulate an agenda beforehand. And obviously any awkward issues, you'd spend some time discussing with them individually prior to the meeting so we could make some decisions at the time of the meeting.
And how many people sat on the committee in this sort of decision-making capacity then?
Probably up to 15. We had a cardiac surgeon there, a neurosurgeon, a general surgeon, a vascular surgeon, the haematologist, a senior nurse, a senior manager, a representative from the anaesthetic department, apart from me, and the MLSO at the blood bank. So it was the renal physician as well. All people that were high-end users, really, and we got their involvement that way.
And so you told us in your witness statement and in oral evidence some of the work that the Transfusion Committee undertook. So you've spoken about the audit of clinical blood use and the introduction of the minimal blood ordering schedule. You tell us in your statement that they also monitored developments in auto-transfusion, is that right?
Yes, yes.
And disseminated articles and information on best practice.
Certainly the guidelines that I referred to earlier that people weren't reading, we would either issue them or highlighting the areas that are relevant to their practice, or point them towards the websites later on. But we were developing all this in the early 90s before I even had email or internet access. And so you had to be physically in the same room as that book to be able to see it. It's so much easier these days to disseminate information.
And so that information would be disseminated during committee meetings with the idea that that would be cascaded down by each department to those that needed to know?
Yes, one of the roles of these clinicians sitting on the committee was that they would inform their own directorate of what was happening and to cascade down that information.
You've also set out some of the policies that came out of the Hospital Transfusion Committee, so they were actually a writing committee in some instances.
Very often, no, we didn't. That committee didn't write the policies. They would adapt and disperse, and that was one of the incentives to try and get the association and the Royal College to issue those things for anaesthesia, because that would then immediately be distributed to all anaesthetists in the UK, rather than just targeting the people on the Hospital Transfusion Committee.
And did the committee review adverse events?
Yes. All adverse events were investigated initially by myself and the Chief Medical Laboratories Scientific Officer, but later on by the Transfusion Practitioner. In fact, we eventually had a better blood transfusion team comprising of 3 hospital transfusion practitioners who pursued those adverse events. And of course, from about 96 onwards, we were obliged to send all of these reports to SHOT. So there's a structure to follow. I think people tried to avoid being the one reporting to SHOT because at the time it was quite a complicated form-filling exercise, but nevertheless we complied with that. And that became compliant across the UK, that principle.
And you've spoken a little this afternoon about what happened when unusual or over-transfusion practice was discovered as a result of audit, and you've described a process where there would be persuasion with the clinician in the particular clinician. Did the Transfusion Committee have any powers to do anything other than persuade?
That is part of the problem of the system, is that you have no authority to discipline people. The advent of clinical governance, people thought would make a difference, but it's a big step very often on grey areas of clinical decision-making to actually launch a clinical investigation into somebody's practice. It's fairly clear-cut when it's poor practice, but when it's on the edge of a debatable area, if you like, it's more difficult to bring that. And may not be right. We may not be right in our judgment either. So I think it's much easier to take the less disciplinary way amongst the clinicians.
And was that was that always successful? In the main, successful?
Yes, I can't remember anybody definitely coming to severe harm from the over transfusion. It was in the margins of you're transfusing back to normal values. Well, that could be argued is of benefit to the patient in their recovery, but when you're trying to decrease the amount of allogeneic use, spare the supplies for the blood supplies, it seems sensible to just edge it down a way, but you couldn't say it was negligent of them to transfuse to 12 grams, for example.
You've also spoken in your evidence and also in your witness statement about the role of the hospital transfusion practitioner. Can you just tell us a bit about what the purpose of this role was, this post was?
It was meant initially to enhance the audit that we were doing, the traceability of blood products, and to encourage education of all newly appointed staff to the hospital about the protocols that we'd put in place. It soon was overtaken by the need to ensure clinical competency amongst junior staff. They change every 4 months these days. There are many more of them than there were. They don't stay on a single firm. And so she spent most of her time either tracing blood components or educating the junior staff. And so the audit was still left to the chief MLSO in the blood bank. And
in terms of the education of junior staff, would that be any junior clinician who is involved in blood transfusion across all of the different departments?
In fact, it involved all people appointed to the staff. As soon as they came as pre-registration housemen, they got processed through the educational program.
And that was that a program that looked at blood transfusion generally and also specifics for the particular specialism that they were, particular department?
It was mainly the process of collecting the sample for cross-match and the administration of the blood once it was received. It seems incredible at the moment that we had to teach qualified doctors how to write a form properly and to label a sample of blood, but it amounted to that. And busy junior doctors often sent test tubes of blood for cross-matching completely unlabeled. And they would receive perhaps sometimes up to 50 unlabeled specimens a week at Morriston. Of course, rejected immediately, and they'd be expected to re-bleed the patient. And if it was a 2-year-old pediatric case that was very difficult to bleed, it was a nightmare for the doctors. But there was zero tolerance because we had to have the identity correct.
I'm going to look at a document in a moment, a national audit of the blood transfusion in Wales. But before I do, I'll just get your views on the Better Blood Transfusion Initiative launched by the Chief Medical Officers. And we know that you were involved in that as a... well, what was your involvement in that? That's the best.
I was invited by Kenneth Calman to present the data on the knee replacement studies in autotransfusion.
At the conference?
At the conference.
At the first conference. And what impact did you see that those initiatives had on transfusion practice in your hospital?
It was taken more seriously by the trusts and the chief executives at the trusts because it was now a government-issued document. It had the stamp. Earlier on, we were talking about the value of having a document that you can use to negotiate with. And that certainly was an exhaustive list of things that they felt should be done at the time as a consequence of the first BBT on the 5th of July, I think it was, the 50th anniversary of the NHS.
And so if you were trying to persuade the management that you needed to do something which had a cost attached to it, having the stamp of the CMO and Department of Health made things very much easier.
I hoped it would be the case. We didn't really need too many resources at the time. We just needed to change practice, and we certainly had the support of the chief executive in that respect. He was delighted to be able to say, oh look, there's a document come from the government about blood transfusion. We'll give it to the Hospital Transfusion Committee. So there's a little cyclical movement going on here, in that we were instigating some of those guidelines to be written in the first place. But nevertheless, we were getting a higher profile amongst clinicians and the hospital management.
So if we can look then at the national audit, that's HSSG 40133_002. You can see that this is a National Blood Service document with the Royal College of Physicians badge on it as well. Report of the launch of the Comparative Audit of Blood Transfusion in Wales, April 2004. And if we go, please, to page 4, well, page 3 and then page 4. Page 3 just to show that this is part of the introduction, and then over to page 4. We can see in that last paragraph what Dr. Wilson says. In this new environment, it's imperative that demand is controlled to safeguard supply. Safer blood transfusion practice, which includes the avoidance of unnecessary transfusion, is now a clinical governance requirement. It's therefore timely that a national comparative audit on blood transfusion was undertaken, since this provides a useful baseline from which to build. Jointly run by the National Blood Service and the Royal College of Physicians in London, it was based on guidance issued by the British Committee for Standardisation in Haematology. The WBS was invited to participate on behalf of Wales and was represented by Dr. Dafydd Thomas as in his role as chair of the Hospital Transfusion Committee chairman. In turn, the Rational Blood Committee Wales was used as the vehicle to carry out the audit. Thus, all the relevant and interested parties were involved. And then if we turn, please, to page 10, we can see it says in the middle of those two slides there, audit details, 5 categories, 18 criteria, and the categories are wristband information, pre-transfusion compatibility check, documentation, date and time, monitoring the transfusion, and reasons for transfusion. And then if we go down to the next row of slides, we can see what the Welsh data comprised of. 15 hospitals returned data, total cases audited 395, range 4 to 40, yield 63%. Do you know what range 4 to 40 means?
I don't. I think it's the age range they're referring to of the patients.
And does yield, does 63% mean 63% of hospitals? Or
Returned forms.
Returned
for
forms.
each.
And then if we go over to page 17, please. We can see under one of the criteria, which was reasons given for transfusion, there were 168 cases where no reason for the transfusion was documented. Of 231 occasions where any diagnosis or information was present in the medical notes, it was judged to be clear justification. It was judged to be clear justification for transfusion in only 26 cases, 7%. So just pausing there, presumably it doesn't mean that 93% of those patients were over-transfused. It just means that it was only clear that there wasn't over-transfusion in 7% of the cases.
That's right.
Was it, at the time that this audit was carried out, was it your expectation that reasons for transfusion should have been recorded in patients' medical notes?
It was something we were trying to encourage through the Rational Blood Committee to the individual participants, that it would be a best practice if they could do that. This audit in some way predated what subsequently happened, which was the formation of a transfusion record in which we prompted people to write the correct things on the front, because again in a clinical situation, getting them to write something once on a designated form seemed to be more successful than them trying to seek the medical notes and then writing it in the medical notes is a separate issue, because they could have been remote to the patient, whereas the transfusion form was kept at the bedside on the end of the bed with a temperature chart.
And it prompted, did it prompt the clinician to say what the reason for the transfusion was?
On that front page.
Form.
Yes.
Whereas if they were prior to that form, they'd have to remember that's what they've got.
The next time they went to the notes to write it down, and they often forgot.
And then if we go, please, to page 20. And we look at the paragraph that starts, when considering, halfway down the page, when considering what the data tells us in general terms, There is marked variation between trusts, but there is generally poor practice everywhere. When comparing Wales to England and Ireland, we find that we consistently perform worst of all for all categories and criteria. Do you have any insight into why that was?
I don't. I was very disappointed by the outcome of the audit, obviously, but we still don't really fully understand why there was that differential. I don't think it was that great, because this was a snapshot audit, and perhaps the criteria were, well, one can't say too strict, because it was a minimal data set that we thought should be filled in. But it also ran alongside with the education of the junior hospital doctor and their competencies. And I think that you would expect to see an unfurling of improvement in clinical recording as a consequence of that. But as with all handwritten notes these days, it's notoriously difficult to track them down. And so we tried, following this, to look at various systems which made documentation of an electronic documentation of transfusion practice available.
And then can we turn back to page 3, which is part of the introduction we looked at very briefly earlier. At the end of that paragraph, starting these risks halfway down, if we start 4 lines up, it says this: in fact, clinical practice has remained largely unchanged since the initiation of SHOT in 1996 and has been largely unaffected by the first Chief Medical Officer's Better Blood Transfusion Conference, despite the subsequent widespread introduction of hospital transfusion committees. Now, that was not your experience, is that right, in your hospital? Not
locally, no. So we saw, in fact, you can see by many of these suggestions, they were originating in the practice that we were undertaking at Morriston. It took a long time. In fact, there was subsequently a Better Blood Transfusion 2 and 3, and that led to the development of patient blood management programs, which in fact had considerable investment in personnel and activity in preoperative clinics, which did improve practice. But it was clear that just issuing guidance was not sufficient.
And just lastly from me, I just want to ask you some questions about the Patient Safety Board that you told us very briefly about at the start of your evidence. What did it do, and to what extent were bloodborne viruses part of the role and remit of the board?
For the informatics service?
Yes.
Yeah. I was drafted in, I think, because of my experience in blood transfusion and the poor recording of transfusion issues and the inability to identify patients correctly. And we tried to introduce a system of barcoded wristbands, which is now is introduced across the UK, which meant that by scanning a wristband, you could bring up all the essential bits of data that you would want to place on a blood request form, like first name, second name, in Wales the first line of address, the date of birth, the hospital number, and the age and sex of the patient. If you get all those 6 markers correct, highly unlikely that you're going to transfuse the wrong product to the wrong patient. The blood is issued against that barcode or 2-dimensional barcode, which has all that information in it. So provided the process is followed at the blood bank, the blood that is issued is for that patient that the sample came from. So it closes the loop. And I likened it to supermarket supply chains, just-in-time type documentation. But there's no way in which supermarkets get their order wrong, because they depend on having a good business model. And I couldn't understand why that wouldn't be applied to the NHS. And it has knock-on benefits in that you have a wristband, even in a conscious patient, when it's been correctly applied, as in anesthesia, you can identify that patient when they need a blood transfusion or a drug administered. And that was my main role in the safety of ensuring that in all computer systems the NHS number was used. Most hospital numbers are numeric, so if people transfer from a West Wales hospital to Swansea, they could actually have the same 6-digit numeric identity, but are a different person because it's a different system. Whereas the NHS number, if included in these types of identifiers, is unique for that one person. Of course, there are unconscious patients and people you can't find a number on, but that's the minority. The majority would be safely identified, and you could then use that as a starting point for the ID for the patient and who's going to receive the blood. So it's a very simple principle, and I worked with the NPSA, the National Patient Safety Agency, on the same principles for England. And to the people that are enthusiastic, it seems obvious, but it was a very simple step to try and improve blood transfusion safety and traceability.
So those are the questions that I have for Dr. Thomas. Could we take a 10-minute break to see if there are any further questions?
Yes, we'll do that. I imagine you were here this morning when I mentioned to our last witness the purpose of this. It's exactly the same, of course, in your case. So we'll take a 10-minute break, and that will bring us back at 25 to 5. I can't say how long you'll be detained for the same reasons as I articulated this morning.
That's fine.